projects over the years, and a Kansas album or two, right? I know you.
I
You
have
do like
material on one.
oh yeah, Somewhere to Elsewhere, right?
Yes.
You did some of the backing vocals and such on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, we will get to that in a bit. We'll talk about Kansas in particular, but I thought we'd talk more about what Jake's been up to lately first. So please tell us a bit about your current projects and any idea when they might see the light of day.
Wow. I may have an all-time high of things simultaneously happening. I've been named an official member of 2, possibly 3 bands, what we call bands nowadays, which is basically online collaborations, right. And that's fine. Hey, things have to change, right? But one of them is called Phoenix. Hi, Pete. Pete Jorgensen is the mastermind behind that. It's some pretty classic sounding prog. Really cool stuff. Pete's a really good writer. He and I kind of collaborate on melodies and lyrics and things, but he does most of the music or all the music on that. Then I am working with a German producer slash musician, songwriter, tech wizard. He's one of the heads of the Steinberg company. Is a expert in Cubase, and luckily he gave me the master suite of Cubase to use when we worked together. And man, I'm learning that thing fast. I mean, I could work on it for 200 years and not know it all, but by my standards, I'm learning fast. And then I've been lucky enough to work with a really talented up-and-coming kid. I call him a kid because I'm getting old. He's probably in his late 20s, but name's Erickson Sylvia, and his group is called Brilliant Liars down in Brazil, and he's working with guys from all over the world on it. Really also cool kind of younger generation take on prog, you know, and it's really cool stuff. I look forward to seeing what he or we can achieve going forward. And then hopefully late this year, I will get the dream opportunity to finish my long ago begun and worked on duo / solo thing with my friend Bill Evans, who's I mean, you see that name on everything. He's a genius level producer, songwriter, arranger, everything. But he was basically the guy who assembled Flying Colors, the band, and serves as executive producer for them. And he is, but you know, the world, as many things as he's done, the world still has no idea what this man is capable of. And he and I write really cool stuff together.
Bill's awesome.
Yeah.
I've known him since, 20 years ago when I started the Kansas Fans board at Yahoo, I guess is where it was originally, or a Yahoo Club is what they called them back then. And then eventually we took Kansas Fans and moved it to its own standalone site. Mm-hmm. And it lasted for a long time until, you know, Facebook kind of came along and it was kind of redundant at that point. But for, 15 years, it was kind of the place to talk about Kansas online. Mm-hmm. And I remember back then, Bill I think he was Carrie's webmaster.
Yeah.
Early on. And then,
he's
done a lot of cool stuff.
He's had positions of some type with some of the biggest names in rock and prog. Manages or has managed a bunch of them, managed Carrie, kind of general managed Proto Kaw when we were doing that. And
yeah, he's worked a lot with Neil Morse as well, right?
Right.
I thought so. And so have you, and we will discuss that a little bit here in a few minutes. Just for the people that are tuning in, thanks for coming by. Our guest tonight is Jake Livgren, and we'll be talking about all the different things he's been involved with. And this is basically a weekly chat show that I started a few weeks back. I've been interviewing people online for years. I am founder of a site called progressiveears.org, which is going in its 21st year this year as the place to talk about progressive rock on the internet. And surprisingly, Facebook hasn't made us redundant. There's just something about talking in long spiels without any advertising or anything flashing around that apparently is still appealing to a lot of people, because even all these years later, we have a loyal readership. And I'll definitely be sharing this there as well, because I'm sure that a lot of people would be really interested in what we're talking about tonight. And so I guess you and I kind of know each other from Kansas Fans way back on MySpace, I think. Yeah. And then more recently, we got together and actually had a chance to play some Kansas songs. You know, in case you don't know, kind of like Deadheads or Parrot Heads, Kansas Fans are called Wheat Heads because that's the cash crop in Kansas, basically. And wheat is a symbol of Kansas. Yeah. You know, it's like potatoes in Idaho, you know, right. Wheat in Kansas is that. So that became kind of a catchphrase for Kansas fans. They call them Wheat Heads. And once a year, we have something called Wheat Fest, where they take one show that's kind of in a special place unique to Kansas's history. And Topeka, obviously, is ground zero, where it all started. So not always, but most of the time they have a special Kansas concert there, because they usually hit Topeka once a year anyway. So it's kind of a friends and family and fans event where people come from all over the country and even the world sometimes to go to this special event. And sometimes groups of Kansas fans get together that are musicians after hours and put on an extra little Kansas concert. And that's what we did. And we had the pleasure of, you know, we looked at what Kansas was playing and tried to avoid those songs. I mean, we played a couple, you know, Portrait and Carry On, you know, but most everything we played was stuff that hadn't been played in a long time, sometimes decades. I mean, we did stuff like, what did we do? We did, well, of course, No One Together was the biggie. I think that was the one that we all were just so stoked to do.
Tell me you weren't skeptical. I was so skeptical, and you know, I don't remember anything going particularly wrong about it. I was pretty shocked.
No, we've got footage of it, and it went quite well, you know, and it felt good because I worked on that thing, peeled it like an onion, like half for 6 months, you know, learned that, and just getting it totally finger memory down, and to have everybody do similar homework and make it come off so well. We did it at a local club there in Topeka. Sometimes they just do it in like a conference room at a hotel, but this time we actually got to put on a real concert and crank it up and really do it like a rock band should without worrying about bothering anybody at the hotel. So that was a bigger
venue, but other than that.
But it was packed full of loyal fans, and it was such a treat to just get together and play those songs with everybody. I'm trying to remember what else we did. We did the Pilgrimage. I don't think Kansas has done that since like early 70s, you know. So that was pretty cool, kind of a deep cut off the first album. And Right Away, little Vinyl Confessions there. That was pretty cool.
That's my doing, because I'm one of the few loyal Elefante era fans.
No, I think that you know, that whole era is really legit, you know, and I think sometimes it's overlooked, but there's some gems in that for sure. So yeah, that was our chance. And ironically, I'm from Topeka as well. I've lived in Atlanta most of my life, but I actually grew up like 3 blocks away from the band house. We all shopped at Harry's IGA there, and we probably bumped into each other while we were in there shopping, you know, me getting pushed around in the cart and my mom shopping. I can just imagine now, you know.
Yeah, I believe that.
So that's like, those guys will write some music I'm really going to like later. 3 blocks from my house. Wow, you know. So yeah, how do you like that? Small world, how it all comes together sometimes. So thank you all for tuning in tonight. Again, my guest is Jake Livgren, and we're talking about all things Kansas related, and Proto Kaw, and a number of other things. But first, I'd like to know some of your favorite albums, Jake. Each week on the show, we kind of look back and think about some of the first albums we ever heard. Not, you know, like even before you had the money to buy them, like, you know, stuff you heard around the house. Because I think that's where it starts for a lot of us. It's like you hear your parents' music or your siblings, you know, and that's the stuff that sinks in first. And then after a while, you finally, it's like, hey, give me some money, Mom. I'm going to cut the yard and go to Woolco's and buy a LP, you know?
Yep.
So, yeah. So any favorites come to mind that were early faves for you?
Well, I was real lucky to be born into the family I was. Most of the stuff that I was listening to before I could afford to buy an album, I still listen to. You know, most of the stuff that my parents played in their house, Steely Dan, Toto, Kansas all the time, because when I guess I was a little young to really pay too much attention, but I was born early enough to where my parents would get the promo copies or tapes that Carrie would send of the albums before they were on the street. So we were listening to the new Kansas albums before anyone else, of course. But I was just a toddler at that time. But, I think that stuff makes an impact even at that age.
Oh, absolutely.
But, Earth, Wind, and Fire, funk. My dad listened. My dad got my uncle into funk, or at least that's the way I hear the story. He didn't really listen to funk much, and my dad's like, oh man, you got to hear Average White Band, you got to hear Tower of Power, you got to hear Steely Dan, and so they would sit around and play that stuff for each other. And I think from what I understand, Carrie really started getting into a lot more funk, and I think that comes through more in the 80s era stuff that he wrote. A lot of it was a little more funky influenced, so then the first you'll probably get to this, but I'll beat you to it. The first album I ever bought with my own money was, this is the one I said you'd laugh at, was the wrestling album. I was really big into WWF.
Nice.
In about 1984. And they did an album. They released an album of like all of the walk-on songs, everybody's theme songs, and then they had different wrestlers performing covers. They had Hulk Hogan's "I Am a Real Man," and I would just put that on and be like, "Yeah," or Nikolai Volkov singing the Russian national anthem. It's just the dumbest stuff. But of course, that was an expression more of what I was into at the time than any kind of a musical thing. But I loved it. And then I kind of pilfered my parents' music collection more than I ever bought my own. I mean, we had a library in the house. I didn't need to buy anything. And honestly, I mean, I never really got into the stuff of my era nearly as much as the stuff my parents listened to. I mean, it was the time of like, mid to late 80s was when I was kind of coming into my own as a adolescent. And I don't know, but when I got into my rebellious phase, I got more into like hair bands and metal because, that was rebellious, I guess, at the time. I got into like Motley Crue and Warrant and things like that. Oh God, it's just really, really dating me.
Yeah, it's all classic rock now, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. So then I think 1992, I got my first CD player, and the first CD I ever owned, my dad bought me, was one that I don't think I ever remember him listening to, but he said, well, you got to hear this. And it was Tales of Mystery and Imagination, Alan Parsons Project. Still love that thing. I mean, what's better to listen to on like a gloomy, rainy night than that album,
Oh yeah, and that stuff is so well recorded too.
Oh,
I mean,
man.
it's like, and that's sometimes that's the fun of listening to a record. It's just like, wow, how did they record this so beautifully?
Yeah.
Left Overture comes to mind.
Oh yeah.
I think that's one that really sticks out
Mm-hmm.
as just a beautifully engineered record. And it's
yet,
funny because I think they did it at the same studio they did some other ones, but none of them came out quite that crisp.
Yeah.
I mean, they always sound great, but
what messes with me is that some bands, you'll have one album that's like the best sounding thing ever, and then they'll have albums that don't sound good at all. Isn't that strange? Like the
right,
first,
and not even
say the first 3 Toto albums are just muddy. They remastered them recently, and I haven't heard them yet, but those things were badly in need of remastering for 40 years. And then 4 comes out and it's like, you know, greatest thing ever. And there's Kansas albums I don't think that sound fantastic in their original release either, you know.
Agreed. You know, some better than others, but some are kind of a product of the time too.
Yeah,
I think.
Exactly.
You know,
and budget probably.
yeah, that the B word. Yeah,
Right,
exactly. So let's see what else I got going on here. So tell us about how you got involved with working on some of Carrie's solo material and how that led to Somewhere to Elsewhere.
Cool. Well, it's one of the most important pivotal moments of my life. We went down to visit Carrie and Vicky for a summer vacation, just my sister and I, when they were living in Covington, outside of Atlanta. And I kind of, you know, we got there, we settled in, and we talked and stuff. And I kind of mentioned to Carrie, well, hey, I've been getting involved in choir in high school. I think I was gonna be a sophomore. And I had already done some music theater and some kind of honor choir stuff as a kid. But I was starting to really take it seriously. I had kind of just gotten over my rebellious phase and decided to focus on myself and do things right. Let me pause 1 second. Are you getting an audience? Because I keep getting messages from people saying that the link that I link to them is no good. I'm just wondering, because I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
I'm not seeing much either. I mean, I see a number of people that are watching, but I don't see questions per se. Yeah.
Sean, you have it set to private. You might need to set it to public.
You know, you're right. I'm sorry. Hold on.
Yeah, I just noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I always forget to do that. Hang on a second.
I forgot to check. Yeah.
Right. It will be better if we could share it with everyone, or other than just the people on my
sorry
friends
for
list.
the derail there, but I'm glad I said something.
Tell them to try it again now, and they should be.
Okay, I'll just put a general post up. Try the link again. So do you think that same link will work this time?
Yeah, it should.
I'm gonna refresh it and see if it updates. And it has not updated yet.
Well, heck, let me just send you another one here, and we'll try that. Because it's set to public.
You have made it public now? Okay.
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Let's take a peek here. All right. I don't know if it changes once you make it public. It might. You know.
It's still showing it as private to me. You starting it over, kind of?
Yeah, I thought so. Let's see here.
Let me go back and click on it again. See if that changes it.
Alrighty, and give that a try there. Give that one a try there, Jake. I think that might work better.
Whoops.
When I did that the other night, it worked right away, so we should be good to go.
Let's see.
Or maybe here, I'll do this as well. Maybe I need to do both of these.
Let me just go back to your feed and click on it again and see if that works. Sean.
Actually, this might be the one. Here, now try it.
It shows it public now. Yeah.
Good. All right.
Was that the link you sent or a new one?
Let me send you one more just to be sure.
They both show public now, though. Just
so yeah, it should work. But hidden technology, amazing. Yeah, I'm definitely got a learning curve when it comes to this stuff.
And hey, John Hancock, how are you doing?
Dave Richardson, how you doing? I got to say, my friend Dave Richardson has a really cool talk show himself nightly, where he and his wife discuss an album. And sometimes it's one she doesn't particularly like. So it's interesting to see him try and sell her. It's like, she'll never like Rush. Even like the early 90s kind of friendly, girly version. Even that didn't work. So
I feel her on that a little bit. I hate to tell people.
well,
I may get crucified, but
no, they are an acquired taste.
Well, it's not. It's the same story everybody gives. It's not the music.
It's the vocals.
It's the Getty.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, this is true.
The
This is true.
elvishness of it.
That's right.
So,
his voice got lower as the years passed,
Yeah.
though. So
right.
he became more of a crooner. Less banshee, more crooner. That's right.
I don't know if I would consider him a crooner ever. I don't think you can.
No, he's those tunes
He's
were
pretty far from a crooner.
not.
No offense, like Geddy Lee, but
Yeah, no doubt.
I think the audience
Sorry
shows.
if I look like I'm not engaged. I am. I'm just trying to share this to all the group.
Yeah, go ahead.
To all the groups.
All righty. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right.
I should have thought to unlock it before I unleashed it.
I want to share this as well.
So I don't know. Do we want to just push forward then? I guess we didn't get too far.
No, we did not too far.
Nobody's gonna hear my plugs. That's bad.
Oh yeah. Well, we could do that again now if you want.
Okay. Well.
Or towards the end. Yeah, we'll recap.
That's okay. It's not like I'm not going to promote at the time too. Shameless.
That's good stuff. Share the word.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the last thing you asked me was the history of working with Carrie. So we had went down summer before sophomore year of high school to visit Carrie and Vicky in Covington, Georgia, and had mentioned that I was getting more and more active in singing. And he said, "Oh yeah, really? Well, maybe you'd like to check out the studio and sing something on my album I'm working on." And I was like, "What? What are you talking about?" So he had taken me down to the studio before, but I guess at that age I was sort of peaking at my interest in such things. And so we went down and he played me some of the tracks that were kind of ready for some background vocals and things. And I think I want to say the first song I ever sang on for Carrie was One Dark World from When Things Get Electric. And it was probably 2 to 2.5 years before it actually finally came out. In between that incident and the album coming out, he moved to Topeka, and I worked on that album a lot more with him in Topeka for the next couple years. But having that experience of being behind that mic and hearing my voice in the phones and the amazing music, and that was it. I was like, I got to do this. This is what I want. And I think on that same vacation, I did the backgrounds for One Dark World and 2000 Down. That was the two songs I think I worked on that very first time. And then when he moved to Topeka, I did a bunch of the demo versions for the other albums on that song or on that songs on that album. Sorry. And it just kind of became whenever Carrie was working on something new, whether I was intended to sing it or not, I would come in and do the scratch vocals for it. And it was just kind of like, I listened to those early songs and I sound like a kid. I even sound like a kid, in the stuff I did in my 20s compared to now. And so at the time I'm thinking, is this good enough to stay on the album? And it probably was for who I was then, but I listen to it now and I just sound like a kid. So I'm kind of glad that it didn't. I wasn't really ready, but as I got further along, more and more of my stuff ended up on albums. And by the time we got, I did 2 or 3 different albums with Carrie. And then we were ready to do kind of the one where I guess maybe this wasn't the way Carrie saw it, but I kind of saw it as this is the one where I'm going to arrive, you know. And it was collector's edition, and we got that thing almost completely finished. Really, all that was left to do was overdubs of Carrie's and then the mixing and mastering. And that's when Kansas hit him up, said, "Hey, you want to do a new album together?" They hadn't done a full album together in 20, 25 years.
Yeah, long time.
And he said, "Yeah, that'll be fun." And he said, "I got all these songs," and he kind of laid all of the collector's edition songs out for him and said, "Take half of these." And you know, kind of the story of my life. I I was at the same time thrilled about it, but at this also like, there goes half the songs I was going to have on the album. It's okay. It all worked out fine. But so they took the ones that they ended up using for Somewhere to Elsewhere, and they were very gracious. They were very, very supportive and complimentary of my work, and kept a bunch of my background vocals on the album. And then the coolest thing was, right after that album came out, I moved to Nashville with my band. And while we were there, Kansas came on their tour for that album to, I think it was the Verizon amphitheater or whatever. It's like 15,000 people.
Mega shed.
Yeah. And I'm sitting basically dead center of the crowd. And Robbie comes up and says, "We got a special guest in the crowd tonight. We just want to give a big thanks to Jake Livgren for all the good work he did on this album and all this stuff." And it was the weirdest thing. I just felt like I shrunk down into my seat, and like the whole crowd was hearing my name. I mean, it was just bizarre. It was surreal. But yeah, that's kind of how it got to that point.
Well, that's very cool.
Yeah.
I think the first time I heard you was on like a Carrie's Best Of, the one where it looks like John Brown in the clouds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Was that just like different ones from the prior ones that you had done that wound up on there? Or did you do some fresh stuff for that as well?
Some new stuff for that. I think I did. You're testing my memory.
Was it 15 years ago now?
I know. Like no, like 20. Almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't even like to think of that. But
yeah.
I did. I know there's probably people out there that are saying the names of them right now, but was When You Walk on that album?
I'd have to look. It's been a while since I broke it out.
It was a really beautiful kind of gospel-y ballad. Geez, they get mixed up in my head. But yeah, I did 2 or 3 tracks new for that. And I think that was one of the times Carrie kind of was just looking for an excuse to basically revamp a bunch of stuff, which he loves to do. I call him the George Lucas of rock. But, he's never happy with stuff. So he likes to revamp and re-record things. And I think he did that with a bunch of his tracks for that album. And of course they always sound better. I'm always wrong.
Sure, I can see that. So let's talk a bit about Proto Kaw. I guess I should preface this by saying, Kansas fans probably know this, but if you aren't aware, the Kansas that everybody knows that did Dust in the Wind and Carry On was actually, I think, the third lineup. And there were 2 prior ones to that the only constant was Carrie. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there were some archival recordings of the second Kansas that were released on a independent record label. I don't know, maybe 15 years ago now, something like that. And that was called Proto Kaw, which, is before Kansas is basically the gist of the name. And the interest from that, I think, inspired Carrie to ring the guys up and put the band back together for the first time in 40 years or something like that. And they were a really they sounded great. You know, it's like they'd been preserved in amber for 40 years or something, or
Yeah.
at least Lynn's pipes for starters.
Right.
You know, so it was like, wow, you know, they really did pick up kind of where they left off, and then they did that first album before it became after.
Yeah.
Which is again kind of a pun on, you know, the fact that this was the Kansas before the Kansas that everybody else knows.
Right.
And that album sounded a lot like, if I'm not mistaken, I think a lot of those songs were in the pile for Somewhere to Elsewhere, and the guys didn't pick those particular ones. So Carrie just used them on that record. I could be wrong, but I think they were all written around the same time. And it sounded.
I think you actually are wrong. Actually,
okay.
I'm trying to remember. A lot of the tracks on the before became. Wait, again, my memory. Is that the first new album that we did?
Yeah.
What was the second one called?
It's the one with the cave.
The Weight of Glory. That's okay.
Cave painting.
Right. I thought of it. Yeah.
Right. The caveman art.
Yeah. So before it became after.
Thank you, Mr. Westfall.
Yes.
That's
before
right.
it became after was a bunch of stuff that was from the original era of Kansas, stuff that Kansas never ended up doing.
That old, you
yes,
know.
A bunch of those tracks.
It's amazing just to be able to remember how they were all put together so many years later, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there was maybe a few. Again, I'm reaching for the information here, but I want to say less than half of the tracks were new at all. There were a lot of stuff that was really old. The second album was all new, I think, and I think we might have done a cover on it or something. Oh man, it's been a long time. So yeah.
And then there was one other album after that called Four, right? Because it was the fourth one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, Kansas fans, if you aren't familiar with the modern Proto Kaw albums, I suggest checking them out, because if you like Carrie's writing, that's where it's continued.
Mm-hmm.
And great band, you know. There's a really cool chemistry there. You know,
it really was
really apparent, you know. And it sounds like Kansas, but it doesn't. It's a little different. I mean, for starters, they have saxophone instead of violin, and that kind of lends everything a little more of a jazzy kind of touch,
mm-hmm.
I'd say.
I think a lot of the guys sort of saw us as more of a jam band flavor than Kansas was. We did a lot of songs where we could just bust out and jam for a while. Kansas wasn't like that at all, really.
No, it's rather scripted in comparison. It's like, you know, 16 bar solo, and you expect to hear what was on the record.
You expect to hear note for note pretty much. But
yeah, and that's
but with
great.
this, we did, you know, Carrie was kind of the maestro on stage, and we kind of followed his cues and stuff, but we would go into long jams, and it was really fun that way. I think that's how it was mostly different than Kansas.
And you guys did a number of gigs, if I remember correctly. Like a lot of the progressive rock festivals were definitely came calling once they heard you were available. I used to attend one called Nearfest, Northeast Art Rock Festival, and I think you guys played at that one. One year, and that was just a really cool weekend kind of affair where basically they had a fine arts center at Lehigh University, and they just bring in 10 bands from around the world that you probably never get to see otherwise.
Yeah.
But they could afford to fly them in just to play this event. And it was just like the coolest thing, you know, and it was, and it wasn't this kind of one thing or another, you know, some festivals kind of stay on a certain path, and all the bands on the bill are of a certain style, you know, because there's a lot of kinds of progressive rock, you know. There's rather commercial stuff, and then there's rather avant-garde stuff, you know, where they're trying to, you know, sometimes progressive is a catchphrase for things that, you know, sound a lot like old Yes and Genesis and stuff like that. And then there's other bands that try to go with the word progressive, as in we're making music you've never heard before. But sometimes you get into some rather thorny territory when you're making music nobody's ever heard before. It becomes kind of harmonically tense,
Right?
And you know, it's not for everybody. You know?
Free jazz rock. Other than progressive.
Yeah, but even wilder than that, if you can imagine. And I love some of that stuff. A lot of it was see it at Nearfest. It was a sight to behold. It's like, wow, how did they write this? You know, how can they remember this?
Yeah.
Wow. You know, live, I think it really was effective.
Yeah, I was going to bring this band up later, but it's a good example of what I consider progressive. It's almost like when you shorten it to prog, it means this sound that we're all accustomed to. Some sort of combination of Genesis, yes, you know, that stuff. But then that almost becomes the opposite of what prog is supposed to mean. It's supposed to mean that it has no parameters. And so prog is fine because I love that stuff. I love all those bands. But what I consider truly progressive is, like you said, stuff that's trying to sound different. And one of my favorite bands in the world over the last decade is a band called Everything Everything. They're from Britain. They're not at all what you'd consider prog, but their stuff is takes so many chances. It's so bizarre. The guy's voice is kind of not everybody's cup of tea. It's kind of Geddy Lee in that way. I wouldn't say he doesn't sound like Geddy Lee, but he sings a lot in falsetto. But their music is absolutely fascinating, especially the first 2 or 3 albums. As most bands do, they've sort of gravitated towards what'll make more money. But yeah, I love those guys. Definitely recommend that.
Everything. Mm-hmm. All right, look that up, folks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, tell us about some of those Proto Kaw gigs. Any were you guys always playing prog festivals? And no?
Oh God, no.
Okay.
Oh man. Woo. I suppose it's like, you know, the stories you hear from any band. There were some dream gigs, like that, like festivals, and then our European tour was a dream because the in Europe they still, or a lot of the countries, they still treat big name, or you know, whatever you'd call us, bands, international bands, with reverence and generosity.
Oh yeah.
You know,
it's totally different than here.
Right. Big spreads in the dressing room, and you know, people being, you know, just there at your beck and call. Great. And then we had gigs. We had our share of gigs that were memorable for the opposite reasons. We had one trip, trying to remember. Well, shoot, we did one where we went up in Carrie's motorhome to do a Christian festival in Garth Yelty's hometown, which is slipping my mind, in Minnesota. They did a big festival in that little town, and it had to have been the dead center of summer, and of course the air conditioner breaks on our way up there.
Oh, great.
The state of Minnesota was at like 102 degrees. So that one was not fun. I mean, the trip up was not fun. The festival was a blast. Got to meet Bill Hubauer for the first time at that festival, from Morse Band, who's now a very good friend of mine. And then we had one when we played in Cleveland. I don't know who booked the show or what they thought we were, but we literally had half the band on the stage and the other half of the band set up on the floor in front of the stage playing the show. That
big, huh?
Yeah. And I got friends on here who mentioned that they were at that show. I think it was a great show, but it was just
it was a tight squeeze.
Yeah. Kind of like what we did for the last Weedhead show.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, we did. It was like the keyboards were kind of on the floor, kind of pointing this way. It looked pretty cool when it was all set up, actually.
Yeah.
And that was Yeah, that was such a fun night. We got to do that again sometime.
Yep.
So, are there any particular favorite tracks from Proto Kaw from those albums that really are some of your favorites, I guess?
Oh man. I don't know if you're the same way, but once you've toured with something, it's not the first thing you're probably ever going to listen to again.
A lot of that stuff, it's like it's totally at the front of your consciousness for a year, and then it's almost like you do a data dump, and it just purges your brain of it all.
Oh yeah.
That's
I used to hear stories about people like Rick Wakeman rejoining Yes, and he's like, I totally dumped all of it. I had to go learn how to play Close to the Edge and all that again. And it's like, yeah, but I'm sure some of it comes back to you, or maybe your fingers remember more than your brain does initially.
Yeah.
But
maybe, hopefully.
Yeah. Oh yeah, man. So much of the stuff that we did is great. Well, all of it. I guess some of them got a little bit. I kind of got tired of Scaunt. To me, that one was never my favorite, but we always played it. But it was a terrible tragedy that things happened the way they did, with Carrie having the stroke right as I think it was right as we were finishing fourth. Because had we, and I apologize, I'm being full of myself for a second, but I was really happy that with fourth I had actually kind of become the co-lead singer, which was something we were kind of pushing towards the whole time. And I had about 40%, 35-40% of the songs on that album I had done lead vocals for, and then there was 2 or 3 songs where we traded off lead vocals. And so had we been able to tour with that album, it would have settled into being what I always wanted to do, which is, I love playing all the instruments and stuff, but I'm a lead singer. I've been that in every band and I've ever been in and stuff. And I was the vocals were great. There was no need to improve them, but I kind of wanted to come out from the background every once in a while. So I was really looking forward to that. And then of course Carrie had the stroke, and that was the end of that band. But favorite songs.
Well,
I'm struggling to remember the names.
Well, think about it. And they have so many interesting names. I wonder where Carrie got the urge to give them such lofty names sometimes. You know what I mean? Totus Nemesis. And, all these, it's like, it's not quite Greek, but it's heading there, and it's like, what inspired these interesting names? I guess I'll have to ask him that myself sometime if I get the chance.
He's a big reader.
Yeah.
And he loves fantasy type stuff. And so I think it goes to that. He's sort of writing some sort of fantasy story in the back of his mind, and these are probably the characters or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think it makes it all the more special, really, because you just don't find that on typical rock records. So I got another question here. When is the first time you remember seeing Kansas?
Well, I'm told that I would sit on the side fills for Kansas concerts as a toddler. My parents would be on the side of the stage, or backstage. And so I know I saw a bunch of Kansas concerts. I was at a Kansas concert inside my mother. It was the first one I ever heard. But then as a toddler, they took me to them and stuff. But the first one I have vivid memories of, my own memories, was the 82 tour with John Elefante. And I remember seeing him, meeting him, and this is funny. It's weird the things that your mind latches onto, right? Like, I'm backstage at a Kansas concert talking to these famous people, but the thing that I remember was my mom accidentally burned me on the arm with her cigarette.
Oh,
That's the thing that seared that night into my memory. I probably ran into it or something, but that's why that night sticks in my mind. That was the first Kansas concert I vividly remember. I'm assuming it was in Kansas City or Omaha, maybe. It might have been that one that has the famous footage.
Yeah, the Vinyl Confessions one.
Yeah, or was that okay? Vinyl Confession. Yeah, right. Not Drastic Measures.
Yeah, well, I guess you could tell by the size of the band, because I think the band shrunk a little bit. I don't think they had. Do you remember Violin? Because if so, then it was Vinyl Confessions.
They toured without violin.
I want to say that Drastic Measures, they played all the violin parts on synth or something, because I don't think Robbie was in the band then. And I've heard some bootlegs.
Because I remember meeting Warren too, so it had to have been that tour. I'm not sure if it was that show, but it was definitely that tour.
Wow, he's had quite an interesting career. Last I saw, he was in Olivia Newton-John's band.
Yeah, and he plays with Ringo Starr too. That's how I've ran.
Oh, the All Stars. Oh, wow,
yeah.
What a gig,
hanging out with him and Luke and those guys.
And Todd Rundgren and other people. I know. It's like that's too cool.
Yeah.
That is very cool.
It's a great night.
So what are some memorable Kansas concerts later? I figure you've probably seen a whole bunch of them since you're old enough. You know, anything stick out?
Yes, definitely. Twice when I was probably late teens, early 20s, I went to shows around this area and was up in the very front row, and Steve handed me his mic and let me sing a chorus of Carry On Wayward Son.
Oh, that's
2
awesome.
times he did that. And I'll never, ever be able to repay him for that. You know, for him, it was probably just this off the top of his head, but you know, that was a huge, huge thing for me. Just an honor and fun. And boy, a thrill to make sure you remember the words. Those are probably pretty hard to forget, but I
it's like no pressure, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Those
awesome.
were the memorable ones for sure. Yeah.
What's your favorite Kansas album? Off the top of your head.
God, I mean it doesn't get better than Leftoverture. I mean, I know that's the standard answer, but that's because it's so obvious, really.
Yeah, I mean, every song's a winner on there.
Yeah.
And it's just beautifully recorded and engineered. So, yeah, I think that'd be the one I'd pick as well. You know, I mean, there's so many awesome ones. And it's almost like, you know, you could have your favorite from the 70s and then everything after that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because went through so many changes. The whole 80s era with Morse was different. It was you know, fresh direction. I don't know how Kansas has sounded, but you know, I give them points for doing something fresh.
Exactly what I've always said too, is that you know, for the detractors of the Elefante albums, I always say, you know, those may not have been great Kansas albums, but they were still great albums. I love the Elefante's writing and production, and you know, I would have listened to those albums whether they had the name Kansas on them or not. So, yeah.
And then, you know, the later stuff, I don't know. I've enjoyed every album, you know, and you know, maybe I'm just a big fanboy. I obviously am, but you know, there's always something to enjoy on every one of them. And right up to this day, you know, the new one coming out soon, I'm excited to hear, you know.
Yeah.
The first song I heard was like the heaviest riff I think I've ever heard out of them. And they're likening it to Rage Against the Machine in interviews. And it's like, okay, yeah, I can see that. This heavy as could be, like a hammer dropping, you know, that first riff in that first song that they released.
Yeah, I dug that new track. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seemed like they're kind of going some modern directions while keeping the Kansas formula intact. And I think that's great, you know. And we saw them, you know, the night we went to Wheat Fest and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was great to see Tom Brislin for the first time. I've seen him with Yes, and saw him at Near Fest a few times. I remember he subbed for the band Camel, one wonderful 70s progressive rock band. Imagine David Gilmour, slightly more jazzy, a slightly jazzy David Gilmour playing over more interesting chord progressions.
Right.
That's Camel in a way, you know. It's like wonderful prog that kind of gets overlooked sometimes because they never had a huge hit like so many of the big five, as I call them.
Right.
Tom filled in for that. I think he had like a week or two to learn the entire set, and he just came in and killed it. You know, and he always gets his sounds just right too. You know, he's using modern equipment, but he's nailing those retro sounds. And I think that's really important. You know, that's one thing that kind of bugged me a bit about 90s Kansas is Steve was just kind of low in the mix, and it was like not particularly vintage sounding keyboard tones. And I think Kansas is a very keyboard driven band, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's like the balance needs to be just right between the guitars, the violin, and the keyboards, where nothing's pushed to the back too much, because you listen to those albums in the 70s and, you know, it's all about that organ being right up there next to that guitar, you know, and you know, that blend really was the classic sound. So, yeah. It's always great. So kudos. You know, they're consistently good.
Balance is a good word. That's with Tom. It's back to being very balanced. You're right.
Yeah, I think so. And then, you know, Ronnie plays some keyboards as well. And, you know, that's kind of how it was. 2 keyboards going at one time was often how it worked. You know, so it's cool to hear that balance kind of regained, because I love the 90s lineup. I mean, it was you know, like a stripped down version of the 70s band in a way.
Right.
But I just thought it was a little heavy on the guitar and violin, and the keys were a little light in the mix. Just me, you know. I mean, I love Rich, and I love Rags, but I just think the balance sounds more traditional, more like how it probably sounded back in the 70s. Not that I would know, because I wasn't old enough to do that. My older brother actually saw them back when they were White Clover, though.
Wow, yeah. At
some little podunk bar place. He said Steve was wasted that night. And I think he just assumed that every Kansas show has been a drunken affair since then. And I'm like, no, it's not like that.
Wow.
They were young and crazy, you know.
Yeah.
Aren't we all at one time? So yeah, that's going way back there. He saw the Who and wasn't impressed either, though. So, you know,
a little crazy.
That's right. So let's see what else. Yeah, love you, Steve. I wouldn't be half the musician I was without your record collection getting me started. All right. So, what was your first inkling that your family was part of a famous rock band?
Well, again, it goes back to like I've been fully aware of that much longer than I can even remember.
Okay.
You know? So it's just kind of always been a part of my reality. Yeah. It was celebrated in our family, of course. Everyone was so thrilled and proud for Carrie, and his siblings were, you know, supportive and excited, and, you know, so it was always very in the forefront of our mindset, especially back when Kansas was still making albums with Carrie and stuff. You know, that was all the way up through me being about 7 or 8. So, yeah.
So some very early memories there.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell us about some more modern bands. I know one of your favorites is Toto. So, you know, tell us a bit about that. You know, I mean, if you're a musician, I think you're hip to the fact that those guys were amazing musicians, you know, and they played on so many, you know, in case you folks don't know, Toto. Yeah, that's right. We follow Kansas with Toto, and this is not intentional. It just works out that way.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's right. It's just following the bricks on the road. And, you know, a lot of people don't realize that those guys played on some of the most famous, albums out there. I mean, they played on Thriller and, you know, so many other ones. They were the top shelf studio cats at the time, you know, and then they decided to make their own record. And, you know, you were talking earlier about the engineering not being up to snuff. And I thought, God, they were in the best studios
Yeah.
around. Why didn't they, why didn't their stuff sound better at the time?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder. But yeah, tell me more about how you got into them and what's the biggest misconception about Toto?
Oh man. Well, okay. Gosh, how long do we have?
About 30 minutes.
Okay, so I became a fan by first hearing the albums in my house playing on the stereo, but then very early on, about 1980, 80 to 81, somewhere in there, we moved to McPherson, Kansas, which is right in smack dab in the center of the state. Kind of small college town, so my dad could go to school, and he met some friends and they started a band, and my mom was the singer. Actually, no, I'm sorry. They took my dad joined a band and my mom took over for the previous singer. And they played tons of Toto. And so not only did I hear it in my house, I heard my parents' band performing it, and going to their rehearsals and hearing it. And so again, it was always in my life from the very earliest times, but I didn't really become like a fanatic until probably 99, when I went to go to my first adult era Toto concert. I went to a couple with my parents as a kid, which I vaguely remember, but I remember them well enough to remember they were awesome. One was the Hydra tour.
Oh, wow.
And then I think one was the 4 tour. So we saw 2 of the amazing shows, but then seeing them after was it Minefields in 99? Yeah. And they played at this big, huge country bar in Denver. I've traveled all over the country to see them. But there was like 100 people. This was like in between the eras of like their huge stardom in the United States and their resurgence. So it was back when there was still a bunch of 70s bands touring and stuff, and they kind of got lost in the mix. And so they had 100 people at this place that probably holds 1,000. And it's the first time I ever met the guys, and played a great show. That it was so low key and personal that they were taking requests and from the crowd. But then after the show, Luke and Bobby both, I met them. I introduced myself, and my dad was with me. That was a really cool father-son trip. And the whole thing was so low key. They ended up hanging out with me and my dad after the show and just talking about everything for like 2 hours. I mean, we just hung out with them in the bar. And Luke established himself that night and every night since that I've ever seen him and talked to him as one of the nicest human beings, certainly in music, probably period. And great guys. All of them are great. Biggest misconception. Well, if you don't know, they are like the band that is the favorite darling band for every stuck-up, tasteless asshole critic, and these hipster critics at Rolling Stone and all, Spin and all. I don't remember exactly which ones, but they are the band that the industry loves to hate on, and so there's no shortage of misconceptions. They like to spread all kinds of rumors about Jeff's death, about drug use, and that they're sellouts, that their music is corporate and all this stuff. And they said that about Kansas and Foreigner and all these other bands too. But some of their songs aren't super deep, but for me, I don't need that. For me, I don't need like the most heady, brainiac type lyrics for all the time. Sometimes I need something to hit me hard or grab me in the soul, or just speak to everyday existence and life and hardships and longing and pain and things like that. I like emotion in my lyrics, I think, more than I like intellectualism. That's just me. So I love stuff like, as far as lyricists, I love James Taylor, Billy Joel, Sting, just anything that really speaks to me on more of a down to earth level. And so that's more where their stuff is at most of the time. But they have tons of songs that are really meaningful. I could literally, you got to stop me. I could go on and on about Toto. But they're definitely the band that you can't proudly scream from the rooftops in just any company. That's your favorite band. If you're in company with guys that are like into Tool or something like that, and you say Toto, it's whatever.
But man, what I mean, you can't say enough about Porcaro's drumming. Everything he played just sounded and felt so right. I mean, there's nobody quite like him.
Right.
I remember when
name another band that so seamlessly and perfectly crosses styles.
Oh yeah, they're
than them.
Those cats are very aware, and they were, it's not only did they play on some incredibly influential albums for other people, but they were into a lot of progressive stuff too, a lot of fusion. Luke's very much into Mahavishnu and a lot of that kind of stuff. And it comes out in the music. Some of those more recent albums are pretty progressive as well.
Oh yeah, there's always tracks. It seems like they have at least one track dedicated to a number of different styles on every album, and I love that. Get a taste of everything.
So I know another favorite of yours is King's X. Tell us more.
Well, that's a band, many bands that I owe to Carrie to introducing me to. Doug Pinnick, the singer and bass player, was a finalist, I want to say, to replace Steve when he left. They were seriously considering having him come and audition in person. They had heard him on a tape, and strangely enough, he's their age. He's something like 10 years older than any of the other guys in the band. So he was up and coming in the 70s, whereas their first album didn't come out till the late 80s. But that's another guy. That's the two guys I've met in my life that I put on the highest pedestal of being great human beings. Just the nicest, most generous, take an interest in you. And not only do I love that band's music, of course, but it goes deeper with them because I know all the guys. They're heroes of mine. And this is a cool story. I had just lost my sister suddenly in 2010, and I was one of these late people to go back to college in my mid 30s, and it took me a while to recover from that and kind of think about what I actually wanted to do with this college experience, and I possibly foolishly settled on video production, video and filmmaking. And I went to, when Kansas toured with King's X, this was 2012, I think. I ended up going to the show in Salina, Kansas, and I watched King's X play. It was a weird dynamic. Didn't really work. You would think it would, but I think a lot of Kansas fans had never heard of King's X, and regardless of how cool they were still just the opener,
Yeah.
And then I went back to go see the guys, and I ended up staying back there for the entire Kansas show, just talking, and I saw them the next night. So I can say that, but, so that night I mentioned to Doug that I had, decided on video production, and I had only had a couple of introductory classes. But he was like, man, we get real super deep every time we get a chance to sit down. And it was one of those nights and things were real deep, and he's like, I feel like you get you get me, you get our music on a level that not everybody does. I'm sorry, it wasn't a conversation about King's X. It was his solo album that was coming out at the time. Like, you get me, and I want you to produce a music video for my first single for this album.
Oh, awesome.
And I was like, you what? I was like, I haven't even had an editing class yet. I haven't had I'm nothing in lighting or any of that stuff. But he's like, I don't care. I want you to do it. I trust you. And so I was so unbelievably honored by that, but at the same time terrified and just kind of like forced into an adrenaline level where, the musical equivalent of picking a car up off of a child, to where I rose above any lacks, any gaps in my knowledge. I've focused on pre-production, writing the story, getting the actors and the location. I mean, that was my life for about 6 months. He gave me kind of a deadline of about 6 months for when the album was coming out.
Which song is this?
Well, it's a song about suicide, about basically not, life's worth living, people love you, don't do it, that kind of a message. And the song's called If You F Up, if you F word up. So we shortened it to IFYU.
Okay.
So if you look it up on YouTube, it's just under IFYU Doug Pinnick.
All right.
But it's funny this comes up because I was sharing that in a group somewhere, and I decided I hadn't looked at I hadn't made the mistake of, actually in this case it wasn't a mistake, but most people say never read the comments on anything you do. But it's like I haven't checked the comments in a few years on this, so I looked at them, and I think it was probably 60 messages of like, this song, this video saved my life. I cried my eyes out. And then there was one that noticed that in the section that I had my sister like pouring pills into her hand to like take a handful of pills, they were white Smarties. And somebody called me out on that. He's like, are those Smarties at 213? Like, yeah.
Darn, I should have used M&Ms and turned them over. Darn it.
I didn't want to use any recognizable pills that were obviously aspirin, so I just used something that was obviously candy.
That's funny.
Anyways,
well, those comments, if you just get one person saying this song saved my life, then it's more than worth ever
it was probably
creating it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So it's like, yeah, that just shows the power of music, and that's,
yes. And man, I this is truly one of the things I'm most proud of doing in my life. And it's not, you can tell it wasn't done by $1 million studio. You can see that there's different cameras used for different shots and whatnot. Oh, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I pulled it up on the phone to look at it.
Okay.
But the heart is there and the message is there, and I'm really proud of what we came up with. And I think I can't think, between the message, the beautiful message in the music, and what I did with the video, I can't imagine a more powerful 5 minutes that you could do for a person who was thinking about suicide. I mean, it was a success, and I'm proud of it. Yeah.
All right, we got a few comments here. My friend Dave Richardson, thanks for coming by. He says hipster critics are the worst, and he's right about that. Yeah. King's X, the most underrated band in the world. Should have been huge. Saw them on the Gretchen and self-titled Tapehead tours.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah,
go Dave. Yeah, that's right. And he said next time you can use Tic Tacs instead of Smarties. So,
white ones, I guess.
There you go. Exactly. the mint ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, who are your biggest vocal influences and inspirations?
Well, obviously, the first singer I probably ever binged listening to literally day after day after day when I was kind of teaching Steve Walsh was my de facto vocal coach. He was, you know, I was learning to sing by singing along with Steve Walsh, so I have to put him number one. Bobby Kimball, all the guys in Toto, Luke, Joseph Williams, Doug Pinnick from King's X. Man, you can hear me ripping off Doug Pinnick at times in my stuff, and I do it shamelessly and proudly. And
There you go.
That.
Absolutely.
He knows it.
Well,
Richard Page I love Richard Page from Mr. Mister, David Pack.
Oh yeah. You know, I got to say, he's an awesome guitar player too.
Yeah.
David, you know, it's like he never gets listed on these lists of great guitar players, but every solo on those Ambrosia records is just perfect.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's never excessive, but it's never laid back and just the bare, you know, it's like, it's just wonderfully tasty stuff. So yeah. Whenever I can shine a little light on his guitar style, I try to, because
absolutely,
you know, it's just like every time I hear a solo on one of those records, I'm just knocked out. It's just like, wow, why don't people talk about this guy more?
I think a singer that almost nobody ever talks about, because I think he was popular in the early days of Christian rock, is Matthew Ward. Talk about a guy that is, I call him the white Stevie Wonder, because he could pretty much do anything with his voice. Total utter control, and the thing, I don't know, are you familiar with Matthew Ward?
I'm not personally, no.
Oh man, check it out.
Yeah, you're making me curious.
So
absolutely.
So good. One of my biggest influences as a singer. Paul Carrick, Paul Rogers, Freddie Mercury, tons of people.
Any thoughts on what it's like to see some of your favorites age? And you know, it's interesting, because a lot of people, you know, when you're 20 years old and you're making a record, you just go for it. You give it everything you got, and you never think, this is going to be a hit and I'm gonna have to sing this every night for the next 40 years. Right. I think maybe we ought to go down a step.
Yeah.
You know, you don't. You just go and give it your all, and then the next thing you know, that happens, and it gets a little dicey sometimes, you know.
Absolutely.
You know,
well,
it's just a matter of maintaining it as best you can, because I notice some guys even now still sound remarkably great. Like Paul Rogers is an example, somebody that just never seems to show any age. Tommy Shaw, John Anderson, of course, he's got elfin magic on his side, so you know he's got to be timeless. But you know, sometimes it's you know, it's you know, you guys are the ones that get the most wear and tear, you know.
Right.
I was just watching a documentary about Iron Maiden the other night, and they're talking about their world slavery tour in '85, where they toured 195 dates over the course of like a year and a half. And Bruce is just like, you know, what if I get sick? You know, that was his biggest worry. And just to do like some runs where they did like 4 nights in a row. And like Stephen pointed out, the way he sang, you know, to just, you know, that would wear anybody else. So, you know.
Well, I mean, how did oh crap, his name is AC/DC singer.
The first one or the second one?
No, the second one.
Brian Johnson.
How did Brian Johnson do that for so long?
Like,
I can literally not sing more than 2 lines of an AC/DC song, and it will wreck my voice.
I start coughing if I try.
Yeah.
That era, particularly the Bon Scott, he had more of that. It's kind of a thing like this.
Right.
Oh, yeah. It's 1969. You know, instead of Grant.
Oh, don't clear your throat.
Yeah. Well, I don't have to sing tonight.
Right. You know. So. So yeah, it's interesting. You know. And
I don't know how.
But you know, a lot of people, I can be a little forgiving, even if age does kind of set in, because they were, you know, these people meant so much to us musically, and you know, I also feel like there's like Steve Walsh is a good example of somebody that definitely changed vocally over the years. But you know, he was the guy that sang those songs, so I think if anybody has a right to reinterpret them, he did. And so, you know, I didn't mind it, even if he didn't sound like he did when he was, in his 30s, whatever, he's the man that did it. And,
Right.
he poured 100% of his soul into it all the way to the end,
Mm-hmm.
and, that means more to me than air-conditioned perfection.
True.
So, where it sounds like they aren't even breaking a sweat, it's, I don't know. That's just me. Air-conditioned perfection. That's my new solo album. All right. So tell us about your band in the early 2000s, Jabberwocky. What was that? How did that all come together? And
well, let's see. My partner in that band was in a band with my best friend in high school. My best friend Kevin Royt was a really great drummer, even at the mid to late teens, and so he was tapped to be the drummer in a band with a bunch of guys that were in their mid 20s when I think we were 17, and so he was playing gigs in bars and stuff, and I would get in as the roadie or whatever. And so Kevin ended up joining another band, and after high school, after a semester of college, my parents said, we don't have any more money. And, of course, all my teachers and professors were like, we'll find you the money. Stay. But I had this offer to start a band with Sean, my partner in that band, who ended up being my best friend for many, many years and songwriting partner. And so we did that. We kind of went back and forth with doing covers and doing originals, but we kind of went to being a almost all original band about 1999. That was when we went to Nashville and did some really cool stuff there. Made it a lot further in that town in the time period we were there than we ever expected to. But then we came back and decided to focus on our songwriting and stuff. And then that was right around the time when we got the gig opening for Kansas in 2002. And that was the gig that made us and broke us, because we literally practiced for that show every night for, I want to say, 3 months, 7 nights a week, wrote a bunch of new stuff kind of for that show and stuff, and never practiced again as Jabberwocky after that night.
Wow.
And the weird, I have no explanation for you. I think we were just burnt out, and we ended up doing other things. We ended up doing a couple of different kind of high level cover bands there, and we still wrote and stuff, but for some reason Jabberwocky just never came back into being. So yeah,
everyday thing can burn you out.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, it really
was a mistake. Yeah, it was a mistake. I wish we hadn't done it that way. But we did do one great show that's still on YouTube for people to see if they ever want to look at it.
I'll check it out.
Yeah. Excellent.
So we still have many copies of our album for sale if anybody wants.
Okay.
I've got copies of my album for sale too. Yeah. We got copies of the Story of a Life album for sale.
That's right. We do have a few. That's how it is. It's like, we'll order 1,000, we could sell them, but then it's like 10 years later, you're sweeping out the garage, and it's like, oh yeah. Anybody want one?
3 boxes of CDs left. Yeah.
Right. So you got some more time, Jake. Usually we wrap it up at midnight, but I think we could go another half an hour if you want to talk about some of your collections and some other things.
Oh gosh, sure.
Yeah, excellent. Before we get to that, though, are there any? For starters, tell us a bit about being on Neil Morse's album. In case you guys don't know, Neil Morse is a contemporary progressive rock musician, a very prolific one. He has a fantastic group. Mike Portnoy, who used to be the drummer from Dream Theater, has been his drummer on every record. So, he's just a very prolific guy. I mean, he just consistently cranks out these opuses, and epic albums. And the most recent one was a double album called
Jesus Christ the Exorcist. It was a sort of reimagining of the life of Jesus story, kind of focusing heavily on the very end of the story. We did it for, he had written it years ago. All of this whole thing is out there if you want to hear Neil tell a correct version of it, but I'll boil it down. He had written it a long time ago to record and never really had the chance, kind of put it on the back burner. And then it turned out that he does a festival every year in his home church in the Nashville area called Morse Fest. And this particular year, this was 2 years ago, Mike was booked with another band on the road. And so he thought, well, I can't do Neil Morse Band or any of the other groups that I do with Mike. So what else could I do this year? So he pulled this rock opera out of the archives, spent a ridiculously short amount of time. I mean, yeah, he's truly amazing. Short amount of time, like writing a whole bunch of new material for it, revamping the old material. And then in the meantime, Bill Evans and Bill has worked with Neil for a long time. And over the years, Bill had played Neil some of our stuff, some of our, the album we've been working on for a decade. And he had given us some really great feedback on it. And it was always like, man, that Jake guy, I got to work with him someday. So I guess I was kind of on a short list of people that he would call on if he ever needed a new singer for something. And he did. He hit me up out of the blue, said, hey, would you like to be in this show and play a character? And of course I've been a fan ever since Spock's Beard. And so I said, shoot, yeah, you bet. You tell me what to do. So he sent me the demos. And I listened to them for like 3 months. I listened to it twice a day from start to finish. And so I didn't know, I was just mostly listening to it because it was so great. Even the demo version was so amazing that I had to listen to the whole thing every time I was even listening to learn my parts. And so I knew every part in the show like the back of my hand, the Mary part, all of them. And so when it came time for the week of rehearsals for Morse Fest, I wanted to be there. I wanted to YOLO, that's really outdated, but it's my philosophy, carpe diem. And I wanted to be there. God, see that AC/DC thing, it's still getting me.
Just speak Brian Johnson's name.
You didn't have to sing, but you had to talk.
That's right.
Anyways, I wanted to be there to see this whole thing happen, and he said, that's fine. I'll put you up for as many days as you want to come down. So I came, and from day one of rehearsal, a lot of the big name guys in the band couldn't be there till the day before, or 2 days before, to kind of do dress rehearsal with their parts and whatnot. So there was a whole bunch of the parts in the show that there was no one there to sing. And so I would just take my mic, and I kind of did it without asking or anything. I just sort of took a shot in the dark, and I started singing all the parts when they would come up in the show.
Oh, wow.
I would sing Mary, I would sing the devil, I would sing, Jesus was there the whole time. Ted Leonard, amazing singer also.
Oh yeah.
He was
and he's the singer for Spock's Now, the most recent
yes.
one, right?
Yes.
That's what I thought. Ever since Nick wasn't.
Oh, and Nick.
Yeah,
that's a whole other story. Meeting him for the first time in person because of the level of fan I am of Shaming of the True.
Oh, Kevin Gilbert, yeah, man.
That's my favorite album of all time.
Yeah,
and he had so much to do with that album, not only drumming on it, but picking up the slack and producing it and finishing it after he died. That I don't know why. I've met huge name people, but I was nervous as hell to meet Nick DiVirgilio. And so when he finally showed up on his night for rehearsals, I was like almost shaking. I was just like, you have no idea how much I admire you. And he was just the most down-to-earth, nice guy. And his wife is super nice. And, we all became fast friends that week, just hanging out after rehearsals and stuff and at the hotel and whatnot. But, yeah, so that was a a chance I took that paid off, because it made an impression on Neil that he talked about in several other interviews about he was really impressed with me doing that and just kind of taking the reins and being whatever he needed me to be for that rehearsal or that festival. And it went off great. And I, long story short, I ended up doing 2 parts on it for the studio version. And the whole thing was a wonderful experience. He's an amazing guy, and everybody in that entire entourage, the whole group, they were all great.
Oh,
dream come true.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if you worked together again sometime.
I would love that. He knows he just needs to email me.
That's right.
I think David had a quick question about a list of bands that had CDs or other physical copies out there that you're on.
Oh,
Jake.
Oh, wow.
Right
Okay, well,
back.
all of the Kerry Livgren stuff. I probably couldn't name you the full list, but pretty much everything he did from 1995 on, I'm on it somewhere. Then there's my Jabberwocky album, which you can, if you want to friend me on Facebook or message me, I can get you a copy of that. Let's see. I've done a lot of spot vocal gigs and stuff for different kind of smaller bands and artists. I don't know if I can name them all. There is a discography site that I found that probably everyone else knows about, but most of the things I've done that have been actually put out can be found on there. I did the very first December People album, the Christmas prog rock, kind of like the stepchild of Trans-Siberian Orchestra. I did a song on the first album by that. Awesome. Then the Neil Morse. I'm actually have a little bit of work on the first Flying Colors album, a tiny little thing I did for them. I know I'm forgetting things. If I had longer to prepare, I could give you a better list, but I don't.
But that's good knowing that it's on the discography sites too.
Yes.
So that'll help, I think. That was a great question, David.
Yes, thank you.
I want to stop at. I'll go ahead, Jake.
I was just going to say Somewhere to Elsewhere, Kansas. I'm on that one. I'm just thinking of things. Go ahead.
Just a few things here. I just want to say hi to a few people that dropped in. Scott Huffman, how you doing? Good to see you. Saw him back at Wheat Fest. I think he was there the night that I'll tell you a silly story, but remember how we practiced at the bar, and next door is Taco Al's.
Yeah.
So I went over there, and I remember eating there when I was in junior high school. I remember when I went
there forever.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Roosevelt, and we would try and go there and back in 30 minutes, and we were always late. It never worked. But they had the best cheese dip, and I was craving something really bad. So I'm walking around with this little bag of cheese dip and chips, and we get back to the hotel, and we're sitting in the lobby of the Ramada Inn there. And I had the girl at the desk warm it up in the microwave for me. And it's like, and I'm sitting in this chair with these long, straight arms that are made out of wood, almost like little tables. So I sit it there, and the minute, and it's funny, as she was warming it up, I heard this drunk guy in the restaurant, like just bellowing, and I thought, I don't know who that is, but I hope I don't bump into him. Well, the minute I sit that cheese dip down, this hand comes along and goes splat right at the top of it, and it just goes everywhere. And I'm like, you're the guy from it's you. And I was about ready to deck him. I was like, I've been waiting all day to eat that. I drove all the way from Atlanta for that cheese dip, you SOB. So anyway, that's my silly little story. And I don't know if Scott was there and witnessed that or not, but shit happens. I got some more the next day. So it's all good, but I was just like, just my luck, settling in to have a little chat with everybody. It's like, man, and I was like, you might want to send the maid over there tomorrow morning. There's like cheese dip all over the chair. So anyway, yeah, fun stuff. That was still great, though. It was great to come back. I hadn't been back to Topeka in about 5 years, actually. So it was great to hang out with my brother and his wife, and and just to get to do this, you know, to put on a show, like, you know, just a few blocks from where I grew up and learned how to play the guitar was
Right.
a full circle moment in a way, playing some of my favorite music.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's cool. I wish we could do that more often. Sometimes I wish I could just move back so we could make an album, you know, maybe one day. I
move. That's not how things are done anymore. We don't have to.
I guess, yeah, I don't have to go anywhere. I know I keep looking at prices of houses by my old neighborhood, Edgewood Park area, you know, and it's like, I could buy that.
Very affordable.
The rest of my days, that neighborhood hasn't changed since the 40s, you know. It's pretty mellow, you know, but anyway, yeah, who knows? Maybe one day.
Yeah.
So what y'all might not know is, besides being an awesome vocalist and musician, Jake is also a collector. Anybody venture to guess, Steven, venture to guess what Jake likes to collect?
Have anything to do with Star Wars?
I don't know. I think maybe.
Thought I saw something that made me think. Yeah, maybe it was that shirt or something in the background over his head or something. I couldn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's Rick and Morty stuff.
Oh, that's Rick and Morty. I couldn't tell, but I saw the shirt. That's even better.
That's Shaun from Shaun of the Dead, and then these are Rick and Morty.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
All right. Yeah, there you go. That's right.
Yeah, I'm a big. I have a geek inside here that I hide with this cool rock star facade.
Well, I'll tell you, we were over at your place rehearsing, and then Jake's like, let's go for a little walk. And we walk a couple blocks away over to his dad's house, and there's a whole room down in the basement where all his figures are. And it was like, and I was like, all elbows in there. So I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to knock anything over. And it was amazing. It was like you had them cataloged. And if I'm not mistaken, one room was about Star Wars and the other one was about
Marvel stuff, mostly.
Marvel.
Awesome.
Okay. I couldn't remember if it was stuff. Star Trek or, no, I didn't think it was Star Trek. No. Do you like Star Trek at all?
I do. Okay. I definitely was the exact right age when Next Generation came out. That, late 80s. The 90s. Yeah, I was one of the ones that pushed our band teacher in high school to do the theme song. Oh
yeah.
Yep.
Zappity boo.
It's definitely secondary for me, but I love it all. I love the movies and all that stuff for sure.
How would you rank the Star Wars movies?
Well, there's only 3, right?
Well, only
That's a good answer.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Wow. God, you keep getting me into things we could be here another hour on. Okay, I'll put it this way. For what they are, the original 3 are perfection. You could change a few things. He has tried to change a few things and shouldn't have. But the prequels to me were a good idea. Terribly done. Terribly.
Yeah. I have to agree.
Executed is the word I was looking for.
Well, maybe you want to put them out of their misery. That's why you said executed.
Executed. Order 66. No. But I believe me, I'm active in many areas. You may not know me from my toy collecting or my Star Wars geek side of Facebook, but a lot of people don't know about me from music at all. They only know me from that stuff. And I definitely have a reputation of prequel bashing, but yeah. So then I think it was good ideas done badly. And I think the sequels are terrible ideas done really well.
The most
Weird.
recent 3, right?
Yes.
I don't think they're terrible, but I do understand that they fork from where most fans really want them to.
Well, okay, I probably represent a segment of the fandom that I was massively into the expanded universe stuff, the novels, the comic books, the video games,
and it definitely took a turn from that for sure.
Right, and as soon as Disney got a hold of the property, they nixed it all. It just all went away. And so then I kind of thought, well, that may be because they want to do something really similar, but they don't want to have to adhere to the rules and lore that had been established. But they didn't do that either. They skipped like the entire era of the story that I was excited about, that I was used to reading about, which was like the point from Return of the Jedi on. And they skipped however many 20 or 30 years of like all the prime storytelling, and then jumped to this weird point where everyone was separated. No one had anything to do with each other for years. Luke has disappeared. What a weird choice. Am I wrong? I mean, I don't know. That I'm sure it's just me, but there were things that I did like about it. But I think that for one thing, letting more than one person write the story gave it a very disjointed feeling. I mean, for me, it's pretty obvious. You know, the second one tried to undo the first one, and then the third one had to had to pick up the pieces of what the second one did and make it all make sense and make it seem like it all had a purposeful story from the beginning, which it didn't. And I don't even dislike Last Jedi. I think it's a well executed, again, it's a well executed movie. Everything technical is perfect about those movies. The acting is good, which you can't say about the prequels.
Right.
The post-production is great. There's not too much CGI. There's plenty of location shots and, practical effects. They got that part of it right. They had the right ratio of practical to CGI. And it's just that the story was just super weird. And that,
I thought they did a good job.
I walked out. Sorry, go ahead.
They did a good job tying it together, but you're right. It got a little disjointed, and they did have to tie some ends that I was like, how are they going to do this? And
right.
They did a good job at that point of bringing it together.
I did too. I
agree on that.
It always happens this way. I go to the movie and I walk out of it going, that was the greatest thing I've ever seen, because that's what going to the movies is supposed to be like. Back in the old days when you could only go to a movie and then it went away forever, there's no such thing as TV at all, or VHS or digital or any of that stuff.
Right.
You basically went and saw it, and it was a one-time experience. And then you moved on, and you saw another movie. You didn't have a chance to pick it apart or overthink it. So it was kind of like that. When you walk out of the theater, it's like, that was the most amazing Star Wars roller coaster I've ever been on. And they tied it up perfect. And then you hit the internet, and like everybody's like, what was that? And you poison your mind with all this logic and good arguments, and you're like, okay, maybe that did suck.
You start second guessing yourself.
Like, I was really young when I watched the prequels, and so I wasn't thinking about them in an analytical point at all.
Yeah.
And so I didn't think about how bad they were. And then there was one video online where a guy just ripped them a new one and talked about how they didn't develop the characters and didn't do this and that. I'm like, he's right.
Yeah. I bet it was the Red Letter Media.
It was the Red Letter Media.
Those things are classic.
They're funny.
Absolutely classic. And yeah, there's no bad points. And they each episode is as long as the movie itself.
Right.
That's how much is wrong with those movies. But anyways, you can still watch them and have fun and whatnot. And I still collect all the toys from them, so I'm a big hypocrite. But they all have ups and downs, and you can't even really defend the originals when people have good points about plot holes and whatnot. So
everything has plot holes.
Yeah.
It's like it's like I enjoy each one of them, but I kind of go home going, I think I just saw the same movie again. Because it's always the same thing. They got a Death Star. They're gonna mess up the planet.
This is bigger than the Death Star. It's different.
We gotta stop them. And by the end, by the last movie, they don't even need a Death Star. That ability is built into every ship to blow a planet up. And it's just like, okay.
Yeah, exactly. It's like,
so it's like, could they do
a Death Star?
Could
then
they do a
bigger Death Star? Then we got a whole planet that's a Death Star. Now we got a whole fleet of ships, and each one of them is a Death Star. It's like,
it's like
something original. That's why I think.
Where do you go from there is the problem.
Where you go from there is the Mandalorian.
That's great. Yeah,
for me.
That's great.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just say, can we have a trilogy that isn't just another cowboys and bad guys chase?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like there must be other things to do in this universe besides just
exactly.
that,
And this is just stripping it all the way
cantina.
down to just like the day-to-day life of a bounty hunter.
Okay,
And
yeah.
I think it's gonna. Have you not seen The Mandalorian, Sean?
Nope.
Get into it. It's worth getting into. Yeah.
Okay.
People in my life who are not particular Star Wars fans watched it and said, "I am so into this show," because basically it's a Western in space, is what it really is. It's like a bounty hunter from any Western movie, except with spaceships. There's no lightsabers because it's not about the Jedi at all.
Mm-hmm.
Kinda, because I won't ruin it for you, but there is Force stuff in it, but there's no Jedi.
Okay.
But yeah, it's rejuvenated Star Wars for most people. It's people forgot about Rise of Skywalker real fast when Mandalorian came out.
And what a better way to connect with the younger audience rather than Jar Jar. They have the that was a failed attempt. At least now they're back to the Muppets.
Yeah.
Hey, he liked reggae.
Yeah.
He was an offbeat kind of guy.
Yeah. But I think it's in the perfect hands to do it right, which is Dave Filoni that did the Star Wars cartoons, Clone Wars and Rebels, which are both great. No complaints about those. And then Jon Favreau, who was behind Iron Man and really involved. He played Happy Hogan in the Avengers movies and just a amazing writer and producer too. So it's in really good hands.
Excellent. Did you see the first one when it was brand new? Like, did you go to the theaters when you were like?
I was a year old or so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, probably not quite a fan yet.
Vivid memories of Empire Strikes Back, which is still saying something because I was only 3, maybe 4. But
your first memory.
Yes, and that was the one that really got me into the toys and stuff. I'm just one of those guys that never outgrew that. Not for 1 minute. I've collected Star Wars toys every single phase of my life.
Awesome.
That collection must be worth some money, man.
I'm not giving out addresses or anything like that.
Yep.
I hear you, but yeah, it's very impressive.
It's a life's work.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
Your life into the acquisition of anything, and it's going to end up being worth money. So
absolutely, I'm trying to remember what theater I saw the first one at. 1977, 78, around there. I think I was about
anywhere in there because
I think it was like
for a year or
5th or 6th grade at the time. I want to say I saw it at the Fox. Remember the Fox out by White Lakes?
It's still there. It's just a shell,
You're right. Yeah.
It up, but it's still
right.
there.
Or it was the one down the road. Do you remember the one across from Wendy's and First Cafeteria next to the Richmond Gorman parking lot? I can't remember what that was called. The Topeka Boulevard Double Cinema or something.
The Boulevard is what I think we used to call it, but I can't remember the exact name either. I'll probably get crucified for that.
Yeah, and of course that's not there anymore either. I imagine,
It's a nightclub now.
Oh, okay.
My band opened for Firehouse in that building.
Ooh, all right. Now you're talking. All right. I'm trying to remember their big hit.
Oh, they had a few.
That's right.
Finally found a love of a lifetime. Remember that one?
Okay, I think I remember that. Okay.
The typical
big hair ballad. Yeah, I was talking with somebody recently about how music changed so much in the 80s, towards the end of the 80s, it was about those big ballads. Almost every band had them. And we were talking.
They had enough to make a compilation of them and then sell that in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
Monster ballads, I think they called it.
Yep.
I think I had this realization. I was in an 80s tribute band a few years ago. And I basically just went through every list of top 40 songs for 10 years. And I realized that the majority of the songs that are, there's probably 40 80s covers that everybody expects to hear if you go see an 80s tribute. And I realized that most of them came from the first half of the decade. Like the second half was about like Whitney Houston and Rick Astley and hair ballads,
Right.
Give or take some other things, but it was just like, I think most of the cool stuff happened in the first half of that decade.
Yeah.
Now Whitney Houston fans might argue that one. You go right ahead.
I would probably go around with you on it too, because you're probably about closer to my buddy Sean's age. And he was just older. He was 7 years older than me. So he was just older enough that we were into all the same bands, but we were into different eras of that band. So
Right,
he
exactly.
was into Mindcrime, and I was into Empire. He was into Pyromania, and I was into Hysteria. You know,
Right.
it was like, and we would go around and round about which was better. But yeah.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I would say a lot of that peaked probably in the mid 80s, but that's just my recollection. You know, I was a big metal fan back then, and you know, that was the perfect time to be a metal fan. It was like the peak of heavy metal, and it was aimed right at our age group. So it was just a perfect time to cruise the boulevard and crank up Pyromania. That's what we do every Friday night.
I was at that age at just the wrong time when all of my favorite bands were peaking, and then like after their opus, they lost their record deals. Every single one of them. Because hair bands, there was so many really cool, like I was big into kind of the bands that were stuck in with the hair bands but weren't really hair bands. I was big into Extreme.
Oh, they were great.
Saigon Kick.
Mm-hmm.
Oh God, who were some of the other ones? Well, Dream Theater, you know, when their first album came out, they were stuck in with hair bands, but they were not a hair band. And then as soon as Nirvana hit, hair bands were done.
Yeah, pretty much.
Suddenly the production values dropped on their next albums. They got no radio play, no promotion. And then in my high school years, it was like I was still listening to some of that, and everybody else was like, "What are you listening to? This is Stone Temple Pilots. What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
So it was a weird time to be in high school for me.
Well, I had pointed out a couple of days ago on my page that that first Jane's Addiction album was really like a shot across the bow. Like this is where things were headed.
Yeah.
In the 90s, you know, because it was just kind of this lo-fi. They weren't grunge. I think they had a little more going for them just being a grunge band, but it was still this kind of back to basics, riffy kind of bluesy rock kind of stuff.
Yeah,
with a very unique singer. I mean, I don't think they would have been anything without Perry Farrell because, I mean, nobody has a voice like that, and that really made them stand out.
Navarro was great too, though.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
He was. Yeah, absolutely. I like him better pre-heroin rather than post. I think the Carmen Electra phase, you know, that would soften anybody up a little bit, I think.
True.
But yeah, they were cool. That was good stuff. So I got another question for you. I'm just about done here. Tell us what it's like to have been a musician in Topeka.
He laughs because he knows what's coming, I think. Well, it depends on who you ask, because if you ask Carrie that question, you'll get a totally different answer than what I would give you. It apparently was a mecca for original music in like the late 60s and early 70s. That I think Carrie's told me many times that like everyone in high school had a band. Like that was the cool thing to do when the Beatles were out and everybody wanted to be the Beatles. And it was still okay for me in my era of playing most of my live stuff. If I can't imagine being one now. There's nothing. There's no scene. There's no venues really.
That's true. And I think the lack of venues is kind of what kills it. You know, it's like even if you had a great band, there's no place to really play. So who's going to know?
Yeah. And it's just such a weird time with the internet and everything. Like, you know, in the 90s, in the early 90s, mid 90s, when we were playing out, there was still quite a good number of bands. There was a lot of ska bands, a lot of alternative type pop rock bands like we were and stuff. And I mean, we even moved into a house where we were living next to half of one of the other bands in the scene when we were in the scene, and we would have, oh my God, we had some wild nights between the two of those houses. Holy smoke. But now it's like your presence as a musician, as any sort of creator of art or content, is online. You know, I know there's still bands trying to do it, and they figure out a way to play here and there, but it's not like it was even when we were out there. It's rough. I mean, we had Lawrence close enough to us that was a real hip era in the 90s with the bottleneck and stuff. So you could still go see edgy, you know, cultured type stuff just 30 minutes away. But
it's a bigger acts too. I remember going there and seeing Metal Church. Remember them from one of the metal 80s metal third tier metal bands.
My era of Bottleneck was
at the Bottleneck. Yeah,
was alternative bands. It was that was. If you read the alternative music magazines at the time, Lawrence was always probably in the top 5 names of towns that every band talked about. It was a pretty big deal back then.
I always thought Lawrence was a pretty cool place. You know, any college town is going to have that extra vibe and that youthful kind of influx that never ages. Athens, Georgia is a great example of that too. An hour away from here, and you know all the great music that's come out of there over the years. B-52s, REM are obviously the most obvious bands that put that town on the map, and it reminds me a lot of Lawrence. It's very similar, you know, and there's something it's like a very fertile place to have, you know, a band. And if you don't have a college, then I don't know. I mean, Topeka has a college, but it just never felt like.
I can vouch for it. I went there.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Washburn.
Very existent.
Right. You're right. You know, it seemed very mannered, you know, like there's, you know, like any of the other ones, like, or even Manhattan. You know, Manhattan had Aggieville and, you know, these places where you could go and
see. We moved to Manhattan to start Jabberwocky. Well, actually, to be in another band that we then started Jabberwocky after that one. But we were there when it first boomed with Bill Snyder and the KU football program. When that really took off in the early 90s, we were there for that. And we used to rehearse in an empty business space in Aggieville. So some of those nights when we rehearsed got nuts. People kind of just walking by in Aggieville hearing a band playing, and they'd come sit in our rehearsal space. It was pretty fun.
In hindsight, Manhattan always seemed like a long drive. And usually it was in high school on a bus going to some sort
more than Lawrence, but
God, it felt so much longer. I know.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah, it's weird.
You know, and it's funny. And now I live in Atlanta, and how far is Lawrence? Like 30 minutes away.
30 minutes.
But and I drive an hour to work every day, and it's like nothing. And it's like back then it was like, are we there yet? Are we there yet?
Right.
You know, and now it's just like, you know, nothing. You know,
well, I have one magical story about that band, or about that era. One night early on, when we were first, Sean and I were first working together, we had that 45-minute drive every night to go to rehearsal before we moved there. And he put this album on. He's like, man, you got to hear this. And it was one of the most earth-shattering, life-changing moments of my life to hear those first few moments of the swelling vocals of Spilt Milk by Jellyfish.
Oh, there you go.
The car stereo.
Oh, man.
Hearing that for the very first time in my life, I was like, what is this? And it for a decade after that, I was on a like a drug-addled, unhinged search for anything by anyone in that band, anybody that looked like that band, any that sounded anything like that. I mean, I was in a power pop just furor for a decade, and that's a thing we haven't even covered yet. Was like prog, yes, but for me it's about power pop. That's where my heart lies. And to me, there's just as much wonder and sugar high and, you know, dopamine to a perfectly crafted and produced 3-minute pop rock song as there is to an 11-minute epic by any prog band. And I love them both, but man, that dominated that threw me for a loop, because at the time I was listening to Dream Theater and Galactic Cowboys and King's X, which I still listen to and love, but I hadn't ever been hit with that power pop thing yet, and blew me away.
Me too, and I just,
there's your segue.
Yeah, I say man cannot live on prog alone, I mean, like I said last week, I said, it's like, well, how many times can I listen to the same 30 records? I mean,
you can live off of prog alone. Yeah. You just got to include everything in the prog category, right? Just, that's prog.
Well, you run into that with, I've had it,
some magazine article. Sorry about that.
There's a whole group called "Is This Power Pop?"
No, what I find funny, after having progressive ears .org for 20 years, I discovered that there's, a lot of people that think their prog somehow elevates them, that their record collection somehow makes them wiser or cooler. Right. And I never really bought into that. We also got a lot of old guys who are like, I've been listening to Genesis since 1970. I'm cooler than you. And I'm just like, fuck off. Your tenure doesn't mean shit to me.
Yeah.
Be a good person and share what you love about that with us, but don't look down your nose as if it's somehow elevated you.
In the early days of the internet, there was some dude that had a whole website of nothing but album reviews, kind of like yours. But this guy was the king of prog snobs.
Oh,
and he was English, and he tore multiple new assholes into anything that wasn't from England. And he had a special mad on for Kansas. He hated Kansas, and he ripped Carrie apart beyond belief. I wanted to murder this guy.
Yeah.
He was saying stuff like, there is not a single note of Kansas catalog that is remotely that has the slightest shred of originality, and there's no melody and all. I'm like, what are you listening to?
He wasn't listening to the same stuff, apparently.
It seemed like some people had an agenda to push, an angle to push, and I just wanted to level the playing field and say, this is a place where you can come and talk about this music without any of this pretense. Because, the fact that we love this music is pretty special in itself. It's like we're all on this tiny little raft floating out here in a sea of mediocrity. And yet we're going to pick sides, and like everybody's up against the sides of the boat going, you suck. No, you suck, and it's like, like, look, we're all going down together, it's just, it's just a, this is a little niche, and we're trying to cut it into little slivers and act like somehow people are
mini micro niche
better. And
no one should be shamed about loving anything.
Yeah.
Love, really.
So I hope we, at the time I thought, I'm going to really, I'm going to change the way people think about this. Well, that was kind of naive, because people are going to do what they do. But, I think we at least kind of set the bar and said, we're not going to do any of this below the belt shit. And, I still have my detractors all these years later, because, when you offer a place where people could talk freely about a band, both pros and cons, some people's skin is thicker than others. It's like nobody is just being a dick deliberately, but, we are in the habit of being honest about how we feel about stuff around there.
Yeah.
Some people have said, thank you so much for all the free PR. And other people are like, you son of a bitch, how dare you let them talk about my band like this?
Right.
And it's just like,
the sycophants.
Yeah. It's like, well, you got your own fan forums for those,
Right.
We're just going to keep it real over here. And if you can handle it, fine. And if not, well, I sold a lot of box sets for your ass in the past 20 years.
Yep.
So, well, cool, Jake. Well, this has been a real pleasure, and I hope we can get together and do this again sometime. Maybe we get Doug on here and we could both co-host. Let's just see what you can do.
I think totally doable.
yeah, let's see what we could do. It'd be great to have a King's X episode of this because
Awesome.
I'm really, you know, getting serious about this. Steven's like, you know, you really could grow this into something bigger if you just don't spend every episode talking about you. it's like I'm out of shit to say anyway after the first 2 episodes. It's like enough about me, you know. I've got a lot of talented friends, so this is a chance to get together and hear what they have been up to. So yeah, I'd love to do this again sometime.
Me too, man. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for thinking of me.
Absolutely. And I hope I get back to town sometime soon and we can hang out, you know, maybe in the next year once the world regains its sanity a bit.
Once we can leave the house at all.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And folks, tune in next week. My guest is Mike Keneally, who you might remember from Frank Zappa's 1988 band. Or maybe you saw him on the G3 tour with Steve Vai and Joe Satriani and Eric Johnson. He was in Steve Vai's band. You might remember him playing the Attitude song with Steve and matching every note, every swept picked arpeggio and tapping every squeal and grunt. Yeah.
While dancing around like a madman on stage in this goofy hat.
That's right. The giant hats. Yeah, man. I don't know how he does that. And also more recently, he's been in Joe Satriani's band as well. And also toured with Metalocalypse. So it was like they played the cartoons on the screen behind them and they'd be up there playing all the music that, you know, live. So yeah, Mike's an interesting character. And the thing I love the most though is his music. You know, he writes some of the greatest power pop I've heard ever. And then he'll turn around and write the most complicated Zappa-esque piece you've ever heard and put them all on the same record, you know. So it's like there's so much variety. And you know, so, and he's another guy where I think a lot of people, he's not a household name, but if I had my way, he would be. So we'll see what we can do about that next week. So Jake, tune in and we'll see you pretty soon. Steven, my Ed McMahon for the night. Thank you so much for fielding the questions that came in. And before I go,
one or two.
Okay, yeah, I think. And thank you all for tuning in tonight. It's been a real pleasure. We will do this again next week. It's been the funnest way to spend a Saturday night in quarantine that I could think of.
Farewell, y'all. Thank you.
All right.
Bye, guys.
You guys take care. We'll see you.
See y'all next time.
All righty. All righty.